On this edition of Issues and Insiders, we touch upon gender-based violence, its causes, consequences, and countermeasures with an expert. Hello and welcome to Friday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today, I have the pleasure of asking an activist about his thoughts on the reasons, repercussions and potential response measures to fighting gender-based violence. For this, I have Gary Barker, the head of Equimundo Center for Masculinities and Social Justice, here in the studio with me. Dr. Barker, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Right then, Dr. Barker, perhaps we can start with a few words about your center.
Yeah. So what we do is step into what to us feels fairly obvious, that gender equality, that is achieving full equality for women and girls, needs men to be part of this, and that men need gender equality. That part we often forget about, that we as men live better when we embrace healthier ideas about manhood and masculinity, meaning we can seek help when we need it, meaning we're more involved in care, we're more empathetic. We step back as well from some of the harmful things about manhood that hurt us. We do this we have a global campaign and lots of work around men as caregivers and as fathers and promoting men's involvement there. We do work with young men and younger boys to talk about these ideas at younger ages. And we work specifically in this topic of why I'm here in Korea around ending violence against women. It is men's violence against women that we're talking about. So we have to talk about how we can engage men in this. And we try to do that in a way that men feel we've got a stake in this. We are part of this. It's not against us, it's with us.
And before we delve further into those details, and Dr. Barker, could you tell us a bit about how you went about co-founding this particular center?
Mm-hmm. So I started my career working with survivors of violence. My family has some experiences around violence and those who are survivors of it. And so my career started on that. I moved to Brazil early in my career, working with girls and young women who had been in situations of sexual violence. And in that work, and together with key women's rights activists, I kept saying, why aren't we going upstream? How do we engage men in this? The violence, the exploitation that is happening is men. And it's not only men who are carrying it out, but I want to talk about the men who are in the room and aren't doing anything and aren't saying anything, who think this isn't right, but don't feel they can speak out. And so I've been asking that question. That's perhaps been my annoying question that I've asked to partners, funders, organizations to say, what are we doing to go upstream to engage men at the root cause of a lot of these problems?
And what has been the response to this effort that you've been making?
I mean, I think, the women's rights field and key women who have been leading this work have long known we needed men to be part of this. They are the ones who invited us in, support our work. We are an organization of women and men working on this topic. I think increasingly the conversation is not if men need to be part of gender equality, but the how. How is it that we invite men into this conversation? And it's not saying everything's good. It's saying we need really difficult conversations around accountability. Some men abuse power. Some men use violence. How do we hold them accountable, but at the same time embrace a lot of men who already agree that gender equality is a good thing? We see it in our personal lives. We see it in our workplaces. We see it in society. Those men who believe in this already, we want to get them to speak up more.
So essentially your center provides them with a platform to perhaps engage to promote gender equality.
Exactly.
Then.
We do a combination of research. We do some of the biggest studies around the world on what is up, where are men on gender equality, what drives violence, what brings men into healthier ideas about masculinities. We do campaigns. We partner a lot with UN Women, with the folks who brought me here for this week. And we do work with governments around policies that need to be changed, expanding parental leave, for example, including men as allies in that. And we do programmatic work in schools, after school programming, in workplaces, to engage men in conversations and policy changes at the level of workplaces as well. That
is quite remarkable, Dr. Barker, if I may say so myself. Now, you spoke about the people who have you here. You are in the country partaking in a UN campaign aimed at ending violence against women. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular campaign?
UN Women is the global leader. Lots of others involved as well, particularly civil society organizations, NGOs, media, in trying to say we know what works to put an end to violence against women, both the legal structures that need to be in place, the prevention that needs to be there. And so these 16 days of activism are around acknowledging that. It's not just this time of year, but it is to say this time of year we make a lot of noise about this topic. And UN Women has been also a leader in saying men and boys need to be part of that. They have their global He for She campaign that we've been an ally in as well, of saying men are part of this. And there's a lot of men who need to raise our voices around ending cycles of violence.
Dr. Barker, this is an impromptu question. Earlier you spoke about how your center also does a lot of research with regard to violence against women by men. That being said, there are pundits who claim that the pandemic brought about quite a bit of violence against women by men during that particular period. Does your research show this as well? It
does, and lots of other researchers who work in the space. So what did we see during COVID? First of all, many men obliged to be at home, right? And women with a lack of able to seek help, perhaps, because of not being able to move and the mobility that's there, but also economic stress. Men who lost jobs, women particularly lost jobs during COVID, but men who feel economic stress are also more likely to express their frustration, their anger in terms of violence against a female partner. So COVID didn't cause violence, but it exacerbated or increased some of those tensions that were already there. That doesn't give any men an excuse for the use of violence, but it does understand how men's life stresses are often one of the drivers of their use of violence.
And speaking about the drivers of the use of violence, Dr. Barker, what else do you believe, perhaps, what other factors are behind the rampant violence against women?
The single largest factor is how we raise boys. Do boys learn violence growing up? Do they see it against their mothers, for example? Boys who witness violence against their mothers are 2 to 3 times more likely to later use violence against a female partner. That is not, again, that's not an excuse. It is a factor associated with. That makes violence normal. That also creates trauma. Boys who themselves experience violence from other boys and men, bullying or experiencing harsh parental punishment when they're growing up. So I think the simple answer to that is that violence begets violence. The violence that boys learn is the violence that too many boys go on to repeat. And so we see what we often call this intergenerational cycle of violence. Now, many men who see violence don't go on to use it. Some of the men I work with are in this field because they saw violence against their mother or someone else in the household and said, I want to break this cycle. But it is the violence that boys learn that is the major driver of it. And then next to that, of course, is, do we live in societies that hold men accountable? The silence of other men. Many of us know men who use violence in our household, in our workplace, in the sports groups that we're part of, and we turn the other way. And so the other part is impunity. Do men feel like, I will be held accountable? This is not, people around me will say this is not okay. So I would say those to me are the 2 biggest issues we need to work on. How do we break the cycle from childhood, and how do we end impunity?
Dr. Barker, with regard to the situation here in Korea then, do you suppose social expectations, cultural norms that is, are to blame for some of the ruthless and very random violence against women that we have witnessed in recent years?
For sure. Here and around the world, men who believe in a set of ideas about manhood, that I have to be in charge, that I've got to be the one who dominates, that I can never be wrong, that violence is a legitimate way to resolve a conflict, that women have to obey me, or that I have a right to sex over women and with women. Men who believe in that cluster of views are more likely to cause harm to women. And if you add to that set of ideas violence that men may have experienced at the hands of other men, we make this violence more normal and more likely to happen. And then the third piece there is the silence of other men, who, because rarely, while it looks random to us at many times, rarely does a man just out of the blue use that act of violence. There has typically been some years of violence there, perhaps an unreported incident that he used violence against another woman, perhaps violence he used in school or the workplace or online. So I think we've got basically a cycle of impunity that we have to break. And so it feels random often when it happens, but it's not necessarily. How many men do we know when we say, oh, I never guessed he would have done that? And then you ask again and people say, oh, I remember. I heard him say something like this. I saw him do this. That silence, our silence is not, I don't want to say it's condoning violence, but we are part of that violence if we don't break the silence when we hear and see other men who show signs of, they may go down a path of using harsh, horrible, and in some cases some very horrendous violence that's happened here against women.
Some pundits here say, along with the silence perhaps, is the lack of relatively tougher punishment against such offences, especially here in the country. What are your thoughts regarding that?
We absolutely need laws in place that say cyber stalking, stalking, online sexual violence, harassment in workplaces, that those need to be, it needs to be clear to all of us that we don't allow that, right? And we need laws, but we also need policies and accountability within organizations. The criminal justice system needs to do its part to be in this, but lots of violence we also need to hold accountable. The duty bearers, by that I mean those who run workplaces. HR departments need to be held accountable for whether they support or they end a culture of tolerance in the workplace. Coaches, military leaders, right, all need to be part of saying, on my watch, this cannot happen. And that's not simply calling out and saying, stop doing that and I will punish you, but it means having hard conversations around why this is not okay. So I think we do need to end impunity, but that is not only by laws in the criminal justice system. That's, let's call that necessary but not sufficient. And the other part that we need is all of us seeing ourselves as I've got a role to call out when I see it. Platform content managers, right? The folks that we stream and watch and live in have to be held accountable as well for what happens on their watch.
Staying with that, Dr. Barker, do you suppose that the media itself plays a tangible role in perhaps nurturing or fostering a certain image of men, which later affects people who view it? Yeah,
we have been doing some research in the US together with partners who look at analyzing media content and how gender's presented, how are women presented, how are men presented. And we see a very clear, both in terms of what we're streaming, but also in terms of the gaming that's happening, which is a huge space for young men. And it's not very encouraging what we see. One, the studies that we've done around the games that young men and boys are streaming, a high percentage, approaching 3/4, is boys and young men playing games in which men or male-looking characters kill others. For no apparent defensive reason, simply for the glory and the self-gain. So I think we want to stay away from any simplistic ideas that simply in itself causes violence, but it does normalize it. And then the stories that we're watching. We also saw in terms of US media, and it would be fascinating to see whether Korea's done studies like that. As we looked at the shows that boys ages 8 to 13 were watching, they were seeing lots of women in positions of power and equality, but lots of men using violence, lots of men not involved in the care of children, not very emotionally in tune with themselves, that is very kind of not able to express themselves in ways apart from anger. So they were seeing lots of empowered women, but not very emotionally competent, thoughtful, connected, caring men.
And staying with that, Dr. Barker, you've been calling for greater involvement of men in caregiving, generally speaking. Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, if we look at what drives the major inequality against women, women's income being far less than men, Korea's got a specific major gap there, right? Women's participation in the external world, that's politics and beyond. One of the main reasons, if not the main reason, is who's responsible for the care at home. Women globally do about 3 times the amount of that. I think the number in Korea is that women do on average 3 hours more per day. That means 3 hours you don't have to be doing other things. That's a source of stress for women. Men kind of need to get that. And the other thing is that men benefit. We live better lives as men. Those of us who have children or we all have connections with someone that we care for. A family member, a parent, an aging parent, a grandparent, a disabled family member. When men do more of the caregiving, we live better lives. We feel more pleasure in life. We're connected. We get to both care for the other person, but also acknowledge the care that we need as human beings. So this feels to us like an area that men need to be held accountable, but also that men report we get to have better lives.
What has been the response, generally speaking, with regard to your campaign?
That's a tough one, right? On the one hand, so many men were raised watching their mothers do all this work. It feels like, many men feel like, well, I'm incompetent, or that's not my work, that's her work. We are so used to women waiting on us, caring for us, whether it's when we're in preschool, primary school, mostly women, nurses, mostly women, that care for us in our homes. It is difficult to get men to say, wait, I can do this too. When men do it, if we can get men, we do some work in parent training, engaging men, particularly from the prenatal phase onward. If men bond with small children, if men bond and see their connections with others, it's an automatic win. Our bodies actually biologically change as men when we're in close contact with children. We get to experience, right, that physical connection with children that does help us be better humans. So I think there's resistance at first, but if men do this, there's no going back in a good way.
Dr. Barker, earlier on you talked about the importance of education, especially education of young boys and perhaps also young girls, to ensure that gender equality is promoted later on in their lives. I believe a kindergarten in Sweden back a dozen or so years ago started making sure that these cooking toys and construction toys are placed in the same area to let the kids know that there should be no difference. What are your thoughts with these efforts?
I mean, I think we do need to start young with, like, how do we break these stereotypes? We've talked a lot around the world of wanting girls to feel like they can be in STEM, that they can be in anything they want to do. And I think we have to keep doing that. And we also need boys to have permission to be playing with a doll, to think, I might want to aspire to be a nurse. Why is that any less valuable as a profession than an engineer or someone in tech? So I think we do have to start young with those. I think we can too often get into sort of battles about it, where it becomes we sort of become stuck in this, that somehow this is threatening to some folks who hold conservative values, and we on the progressive side can sometimes be a little too precious about that. But I think it is, how do we raise our sons and daughters to see that these restrictions about gender norms are actually more harmful than they are good. And I think it also becomes a place where boys can acknowledge that, we experience bullying. Our lives get better when we're able to break out of that and say, that's also not okay. To have to not acknowledge when you need some help, whether for a mental health issue or for a physical pain that you're experiencing, that we need boys to be able to feel they can ask for help. So all those things, we've got to find ways, but in thoughtful, engaging ways. It can't feel like preaching, right? That's when I think too often we make it like that of, no, you must be like this. It's got to be a dialogue.
And speaking about dialogue, how do we seek to reverse this unhealthy trend of perhaps a certain image of manhood among the younger adults?
Yeah. I mean, I think lots of young men in Korea and around the world, it's a confusing time. For our father's generation, right, he was the breadwinner for the most part. He did most of the work. He was most of the income outside the house, and our mothers did all the caregiving. In these last 20, 30 years in Korea and elsewhere, right, we've had a world that says women are in the workplace, equal to me. They can be heads of state. They should be heads of state. But we haven't really, I have, as father of a daughter, I feel like the world has created lots of spaces to say, you can aspire to all you want to be. I don't think we've helped men with sort of new scripts, with new ideas that say, wait a minute, this is a more complex world that we live in now. And women are not going to wait on you. It is not going to be your mother's generation and all the experiences that our mothers had and the frustration around that because of that. This is a new world. How do we bring sons and boys into that? I think we see a lot of men threatened by these changes. And I think we've got to do a lot of listening to men. It's not to ignore the harmful behaviors and all that's happening online in the so-called manosphere here and elsewhere, but it is to say what's worrying them and how do we step into that conversation with compassion, but also saying it's not okay to step back into a version of manhood that says you're in charge and your anger is not helping us move ahead. But we have to do that with compassion, and I think that's been really challenging for us.
And once that is achieved, Dr. Barker, what would you say, very broadly speaking, how does gender equality benefit both men and, of course, women?
I think there's a lot of men, young men in particular, who are already getting this, who are doing their portion of the care work, are taking time off when they have a child, for example, who see, all the advances of gender equality and around the LGBTI movement of saying we can break out of these norms and we live better when we do it. Couples, when men share the care work, a heterosexual couple where there's children present, where men share the care work, both he reports he's happier and she reports she's happier. And it's pretty obvious, right? When we share those things that we can see kind of how the couple relationship feels more peaceful. So I don't think we're making this up. I think there's a lot of couples who are living that kind of equality and see that it pays forward in multiple ways.
Right, Dr. Barker, thank you so much for your time today to talk about the importance of getting men more involved in caregiving to ensure, with compassion that is, to ensure a more equal society. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Right, well, on that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Have a great weekend and see you same time next Monday.